Base and Superstructure. Chapter 4 of On the Reproduction of Capitalism, by Louis Althusser. We have already had occasion to insist on the revolutionary nature of the Marxist conception of the social whole with regard to what distinguishes it from the Hegelian totality. We said, this thesis simply restates well-known propositions of historical materialism, that Marx conceives the structure of every society as constituted by levels or instances articulated by a specific determination, the infrastructure or economic base, the unity of the productive forces and the relations of production, and the superstructure, which itself comprises two levels or instances, the political legal level, law and the state, and the ideological level, the various ideologies, religious, moral, legal, political, and so on. Part 1. Advantages of a topographical representation. This conception is of theoretical and didactic interest. It makes us see the difference between Marx and Hegel. It has a crucial theoretical advantage as well. It allows us to inscribe in the theoretical dispositive of its essential concepts what we have called the index of effectivity of each one. What does this mean? It will be readily agreed that this representation of the structure of every society as an edifice comprising a base, or infrastructure, on which the two floors of the superstructure are erected is a metaphor. To be quite precise, it is a spatial metaphor, the metaphor of a topography, topique. Like all metaphors, this one, too, suggests or makes us see something. What? Precisely the fact that the upper floors could not stay up, in the air, all by themselves if they did not rest, precisely, on their base, and its foundations. Thus the object of the metaphor of the edifice is, above all, to represent determination in the last instance by the economic base. The effect of this spatial metaphor is accordingly to assign the base an index of effectivity known by the famous terms, determination in the last instance of what happens in the upper floors of the superstructure by what happens in the economic base. Setting out from this index of effectivity in the last instance, the floors of the superstructure are obviously endowed with different indices of effectivity. What kind of indices? We can say straight away, with no risk of error, that the upper floors of the superstructure are not determinant in the last instance, but are, rather, determined by the effectivity of the base, and that if they are determinant in their own way, which we have not yet defined, they are such insofar as they are determined by the base. Their index of effectivity, or determination, as determined by the determination in the last instance of the base, is thought in two forms in the Marxist tradition. 1. The superstructure is relatively autonomous with respect to the base, and 2. The superstructure reacts back on the base. We can therefore say that the big theoretical advantage of the Marxist topography, that is, of the spatial metaphor of the edifice, base and superstructure, is that it simultaneously makes us see that questions of determination, or of index of effectivity, are crucial, that it makes us see that it is the base which determines the whole edifice in the last instance, and, consequently, that it requires us to pose the theoretical problem of the type of derivative effectivity that is specific to the superstructure, or, in other words, that it compels us to think what the Marxist tradition designates with the linked terms of the relative autonomy of the superstructure and the action of the superstructure back on the base. On the other hand, the major disadvantage of this representation of the structure of all societies by the spatial metaphor of the edifice is, obviously, that it is metaphorical, in other words, that it remains descriptive. It now seems to us imperative to represent things differently. Let there be no mistake, we are in no sense rejecting the classic metaphor, since it is this metaphor itself which requires that we go beyond it. And we are not going beyond it in order to reject it as obsolete. We would simply like to try to think what it gives us in the form of a description. Part 2. Limits of a topographical representation. Let us lay our cards on the table. We think that it is by setting out from reproduction that it becomes possible and necessary to envisage the existence and nature of the superstructure. Simply adopting the standpoint of reproduction sheds light on several questions whose existence the spatial metaphor of the edifice indicated, but to which it could not furnish a conceptual response. We have to make a new stipulation here. In the texts we referred to a moment ago, we tended, taking up certain indications made by Marx and his successors, to emphasize the distinction, within the superstructure, between what we called, on the one hand, the legal political superstructure, law and the state, and, on the other, the ideological superstructure, the various ideologies. To emphasize this distinction was itself a way of making the reader see that there are differences in indices of effectivity between these two levels of the superstructure as well. Here, the spatial metaphor of the edifice also helped us to show that the legal political superstructure is, as a rule, more effective than the ideological superstructure, although the ideological superstructure, too, is endowed with relative autonomy in its relations with the legal political superstructure and is capable of reacting back on it. However, in emphasizing this distinction between the two forms of the superstructure, we remained within the logic of our metaphor and, accordingly, within its limits, those of a description. Here, too, it has become imperative to represent things differently. That is, we should represent the relations between, first, the law state and, second, the ideologies in a way different from that dictated by the logic of the descriptive metaphor of the edifice. Let us take our idea to its logical conclusion. We should also represent differently from how we have so far what is involved in the singular dyad designated by our expression legal political superstructure. We should account for the hyphen that unites law and the state in the expression legal political, asking exactly what we can and should think to justify, or question, this hyphen. Finally, we should also ask why we use, and whether it is legitimate to use, an expression that puts law before the state, and whether it would not, rather, be preferable to put law after the state, or whether these questions of before and after, far representing a solution, are merely the index of a problem that should therefore be posed in completely different terms. All these questions, which we are raising in summary fashion, but, we think, correctly, can be summed up in the form of the following problems. What is law? What is the state? What is ideology? What are the relations between law, the state and ideology? In what kinds of groupings, law state or state law, and so on, can we represent these relations in order to think them? Our basic thesis is that it is only possible to pose these problems, and therefore to resolve them, from the viewpoint of reproduction. We will briefly analyze law, the state and ideology from that viewpoint. And we will try to bring out what happens from the viewpoint of practice and production on the one hand and, at the same time, of reproduction on the other. Only by taking this difference between reproduction and production into consideration can we provide the solution to the problems that we are here posing. One final remark before we enter into this analysis. Since we are looking for answers to complex questions that bear on the very order that they imply, and since we are, for the time being, ignorant of that order, we shall adopt a provisionally arbitrary order, which we shall of course have to rectify once we have made these analyses. We propose, then, to proceed in the following arbitrary order: law, state, ideology. We shall see that, as we proceed, we shall have to modify that order for an unexpected reason. We are going to discover a new reality,